Welcome in to the Veiled Archive.
Welcome in or back to the Veiled Archive. If you're new here, understand this is not a review channel. This is an excavation site. We do not deal in the popular or the loud. We deal in the buried. We dig through the strata of Kindle Unlimited, of KDP to Select, and we scour the emerging expanse of TikTok and social media platforms to find the transformational works. The books that don't just scare you, but change the architecture of your fear. Usually, we are dusting off new bones in the indie graveyard, introducing you to names you have never heard. But today we return to a familiar crypt. We have spoken before of the architect Joshua Bish. We walked with him through The Lady in Flesh, Book 1 in his Psalm of the Terror trilogy, a series that defines what we call psychological siege, the feeling of being trapped in a room with your own trauma. We all knew Bish was an author to watch. We knew he was building something special. Well, consider Echoes in the Stone, the ribbon-cutting ceremony. If the Psalm trilogy was a sentence, a long, complex sentence about grief and survival, then this book is the bold, jagged exclamation point at the end. It is the punctuation mark that validates everything that came before it, while simultaneously signaling a terrifying evolution. We are going to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, but we are not going for a ghost hunt. We are going to witness a graduation. We are going to watch an author move from siege to annihilation. I must warn you, usually we tell you to turn on the lights. For this one, you might want to pour yourself a glass of water, because this story leaves a taste in your mouth, the taste of old metal, wet stone, and something that has been hungry for a very long time. Let's open the file. To understand Echoes in the Stone, we must first discard the traditional map of the haunted asylum. Usually in these stories, the building is a container, a passive jar holding angry spirits. Joshua Bish rejects this architecture entirely. In Echoes, the asylum is not a container, it is an organism. The narrative opens with a deceptive, almost sterile calm. We are introduced to Ellie Glass, a freelance reporter who operates with the skepticism of her trade. She isn't here to hunt ghosts, she is here to hunt a story. She arrives at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, a sprawling monument to forgotten pain, intending to document its history for a piece of local lore. Bish initially grounds us in the mundane. We join Ellie on a standard tourist walkthrough, led by a guide named Daniel. And I want to pause on Daniel for a moment, because he's a masterclass in structural pacing. He is not a sinister figure, he is the voice of reasonable history. He offers what I call polite informational posits, facts about the architecture, the capacity of the wards, the daily routines. But beneath his scripted dialogue, Bish plants the initial seeds of dread. Daniel's voice echoes a little too loudly. The shadows he points to seem to stretch further than the light allows. He is the last tether to the rational world. The structural pivot happens, as it often does in the best horror, when the protagonist steps off the approved path. Ellie breaks away from the tour group, lingering in the gift shop, and this is where the genius of Bish's sensory annihilation kicks in. The moment she is alone, the reality of the asylum shifts. It doesn't scream, it breathes. Ellie realizes that the silence she hears is not the absence of noise, but the rhythm of respiration. The floorboards don't just creak under her weight, they groan with a biological elasticity. The stone walls begin to weep condensation that smells of something far older than water. And then, the taste. This is the detail that made me put the book down and reach for a glass of water myself. Bish describes the air itself as having a flavor. It laces Ellie's tongue with a rancid residue, a mixture of copper, old blood, and wet iron. It is the taste of a battery on your tongue, the taste of ozone and rot. The atmosphere violates her physiology. She isn't just in the asylum is in her. Driven by this sensory assault, Ellie pushes deeper, seeking the source. She eventually unearths the patient records of Dr. W. Freeman. Now, history buffs will recognize the name and the weight of the atrocities associated with the ice pick lobotomy. But Bish doesn't use Freeman as a history lesson, he uses him as a bridge. As Ellie reads the records, the timeline collapses. She begins to witness visions of the spectral doctor performing his tasks. But these aren't ghostly replays, they are vivid, high fidelity hallucinations. She sees the precision of the instrument. She hears the bones snap. This, the psychological dread elevates to an impressive scale because Ellie realizes the truth behind the procedures. The patients weren't being treated. They weren't even being tortured in the traditional sense. They were being prepared. The story culminates in the realization that the asylum's population didn't just die off due to mistreatment. They went missing. They were consumed. The building and the entity that wears the building like a skin required sustenance. Ellie's journey transitions from a reporter seeking a scoop to a biological organism trying to avoid digestion. The air gets colder, the taste of metal gets stronger, and the asylum warns her, and the reader, that to venture further is to become part of the menu. That is the narrative spine of Echoes in the Stone. It is a journey from the tour guide's polite fiction to the wet, red reality of the basement. So, why does this book work? Why does it feel different from the thousand other asylum stories cluttering the horror shelves? The answer lies in a specific structural shift that Joshua Bish has engineered. He has moved the goalposts of his own genre. The shift from siege to annihilation. In the Psalm of the Terror trilogy, Bish perfected what we call psychological siege. In a siege, the threat is external. You are trapped in a room and the monster is banging on the door. The horror comes from the anticipation of the breach. Your mind fractures because you are waiting for the end. Echoes in the Stone is not a siege, it's a psychological annihilation. In this architecture, the threat is not banging on the door. The threat is the door. The threat is the air you are breathing. The horror doesn't wait to breach your defenses, it bypasses them entirely by entering your bloodstream. Ellie isn't fighting to keep the monster out. She is realizing that she has already been swallowed. This is a critical distinction for the reader. You don't feel trapped reading this book, you feel infected. The metabolism of the setting. We have all read the haunted house blueprint 100 times. In the standard model, the house is a container. It holds ghosts the way a jar holds water. The house might be spooky, but it is passive. It is dead matter. Bish rejects that blueprint. He grants the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum a metabolism. Pay attention to the verbs he uses. The building does not stand, it waits. The boards do not creak, they groan. The stone does not leak, it weeps. These are biological functions. There is a moment, and it is perhaps the most terrifying structural choice in the novel, where the protagonist realizes the building is regulating its own temperature. It is not cold because the heating is broken. It is cold because the entity is diverting energy to its digestion. By treating this setting as a biological predator rather than a supernatural location, Bish removes the possibility of a safe room. You cannot hide from a stomach while you are inside it. The taste of the text. Finally, we must talk about the taste. I read a lot of horror. I am used to visual horror. I am used to auditory horror. I am rarely confronted with gustatory horror, horror that attacks the sense of taste. Bish weaponizes this sense. He describes the air in the asylum as having a rancid residue, a flavor of old copper, wet wool, and battery acid. And he writes it with such tactile precision that it triggers a somatic response in the reader. I will confess this with you. There were moments while reading chapter 8 where I had to put the Kindle down and physically swig a glass of water. I needed to wash that phantom taste of that asylum out of my own mouth. When an author can make you physically react, not jump, not scream, but taste the rot on their pages, they have achieved total immersion. That is what sets this book apart. It doesn't just want your attention, it wants your physiology. Now we need to step away from the damp halls of the asylum and talk about the architect behind the nightmare. In the Veiled Archive, we use the term architect very specifically. It is not just someone who writes a book. It is someone who understands the structure of the genre and contributes to its foundation. Joshua Bish is becoming a cornerstone of this channel, and for good reason. Evolution of the craft. We have watched him grow in real time. We saw the raw emotional bleeding of the Psalm of the Terror trilogy, and now with Echoes in the Stone, we are seeing a professional sharpening of the blade. This is an author who is not content to stay in one lane. He is pushing his own boundaries, moving from the ethereal to the visceral. But what impresses me most about Bish isn't just what he's doing on the page, it's what he's doing off the page. The ambassador of the indie dark. Writing is a solitary confinement. It is easy to lock yourself in a room and speak only to your ghosts. But Joshua Bish has chosen a different path. He is extending his efforts outward. We are seeing him move into the physical spaces of the genre. He is stepping into the realm of conventions, stepping out from behind the keyboard to shake hands with the readers who inhabit his nightmares. This is a critical step. When an author makes themselves accessible, when they connect across multiple platforms, they stop being a name on a cover and become a human being you want to root for. The community builder. And this is the part that matters most to us here at the archive. The indie horror community can be a crab bucket or it can be a ladder. Bish is building a ladder. He has become a resource for other indie authors, offering his time, his platform, and his insightful advice to those just starting the climb. We see him constantly encouraging others, sharing their work, and offering the kind of guidance that only comes from being in the trenches. He understands that a rising tide lifts all graves. There is a beautiful irony here. Joshua Bish writes about isolation. He writes about places that want to consume you. He writes about the psychological annihilation of the self, and yet in reality, he is doing the exact opposite. He is building connection. He is preserving the self of the indie author community. So when you buy Echoes in the Stone, you aren't just buying a terrifying weekend read. You are funding an architect who is actively reinvesting in the ecosystem of horror. You are supporting a good man who writes very, very bad things. If you are an aspiring writer or just a reader who wants to talk to a human being rather than a brand, find Joshua on his platforms. Engage with him. He is one of the few who will actually write back. A documentary of dread. To truly understand why Echoes in the Stone is terrifying, we have to stop talking about scary stories and start talking about engineering. Horror is not random, it is built on specific structural blueprints. For the last century, the genre has relied on two primary engines to generate fear: atmospheric siege and psychological siege. Let's dismantle them so we can see how Joshua Bish has broken them both to build something worse: the atmospheric siege. Atmospheric siege is one of the oldest tricks in the book. This is the domain of the architect Shirley Jackson or Algernon Blackwood. In this model, the horror is external. The protagonist is a vessel and the setting is a vice. Think of The Haunting of Hill House. The house is a bad place. It has geometry that is wrong. It has a will. The fear comes from the pressure the building exerts on the human. It is the fear of the diving bell. The ocean is outside, crushing in, and you are praying the glass holds. In atmospheric siege, the walls are the enemy because they are closing in. You are trapped by the space. Then we have the psychological siege. This is the domain of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, or Poe. Here the architecture flips. The threat is not the house, the threat is the mind. In the yellow wallpaper, the room is just a room. The horror is that the protagonist is trapped inside her own skull. The siege is internal. The call is coming from inside the house. The fear isn't that the walls are crushing you, it's that you are projecting your own madness onto the walls. In psychological siege, you are trapped by yourself. For decades, these were the two flavors. You are either fighting the house or you're fighting your mind. But what happens when the author decides that siege is too passive? A siege implies you can wait it out. A siege implies that you hold the line. You survive. Joshua Bish looks at these two blueprints and says no. In Echoes of the Stone, he doesn't use siege warfare, he uses biological warfare. He takes the atmosphere, the external, and forces it to metabolize the psychology, the internal. The asylum doesn't just press in on Ellie, it enters her via the senses. Remember the taste of metal? That is the moment the siege ends and the infection begins. And he takes the psychology and externalizes it. The madness isn't just in her head, it is physically manifesting as the food the asylum eats. This is what I call structural annihilation. The barrier between the place and the person dissolves. In a siege, you are a victim in a trap. In annihilation, you are calorie. The old architects taught us to fear the dark because it hides things. The new architects, like Bish, teach us to fear the dark because it is hungry. When you read Echoes, you aren't watching a woman get haunted. You are watching a woman get digested. And that is horror that Shirley Jackson could only dream of. We're going to stop treating your library like a trophy case and start treating it like a laboratory. You have these books and films on your shelf because they introduced you to specific types of fear. But every masterpiece has a boundary, a place where the experiment stopped. I want to issue an investigative mandate. I want you to revisit these 6 titles, not to enjoy them, but to study their limitations. And then I want you to read Echoes in the Stone to see what happens when those limitations are removed. The visual mandate. Case 1 study, The Voice of the Asylum. Session 9. The mechanism. You revere Session 9 because it was one of the first films to successfully give a building a voice. The Danvers State Hospital is not a set, it is a character. The horror is delivered through the Simon tapes, audio recordings of the past patient that infect the present crew. But structurally, Session 9 relies on passive observation. The crew listens to the tapes. They look at the peeling paint. They are haunted by the past, but the building itself is largely static. It waits for them to crack. Echoes in the Stone rejects that passive. Bish argues that if a building has a voice, it must also have a throat. It must have lungs. Watch Session 9 to understand the ghost story model. The building remembers. Then read Echoes to understand the biological model. The building breathes. Bish takes the atmosphere of Danvers and gives it a respiratory system. He proves that the walls don't need tape recorders to speak. They just need you to stop breathing so they can start. In Case 2 study, The Architecture of Refraction. Annihilation. The Southern Reach trilogy. The mechanism. We look to Annihilation for the concept of the shimmer. This is the idea of biological refraction, that an environment can act like a prism, not for light, but for DNA. It remixes the observer with the observed. In Garland's work, this is an alien imposition. It is sci-fi. It is the other. It allows us to distance ourselves because the source is extraterrestrial. Joshua Bish creates a gothic shimmer. He takes that mechanic of biological remixing and applies it to the West Virginia hills. The taste of metal in Ellie's mouth is the refraction point. She is not being mutated by an alien meteor. She is being mutated by human history. Study Annihilation to see how an environment can change a human body. Then read Echoes to see how trauma can do the same thing. Bish proves you don't need aliens to lose your humanity. You just need a place that demands you give it up. In Case Study 3, The Thermodynamics of Hunger. The Terror, Season 1. The mechanism. We study the terror for the Toonbog. But the genius of that show wasn't the bear monster, it was the cold. The show threatened temperature as a predatory intelligence. The cold wanted them dead. The cold was an environmental hazard. The Toonbog was the eater. They were separate threats. In Echoes, the cold and the eater are the same thing. The asylum is the temperature drop. The entity is the freeze. Bish fuses the environmental hazard with the monster. The asylum is an icy wasteland acting as a stomach. Watch the terror to feel the cold in your skin. Read Echoes to feel the cold in your marrow. Bish weaponizes the temperature drop not just to freeze you, but to preserve you for consumption. And the literary mandate. The House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. The mechanism. House of Leaves is the undeniable king of the labyrinth. It taught us to fear the 5.5 minute hallway, the geometry that violates physics. It is a cerebral academic puzzle. The limitation is the academic layer. House of Leaves is a documentary about a house. There are layers of safety between you and the monster. It is an intellectual fear. Echoes in the Stone is the visceral application of Danielewski's theory. Bish strips away the footnotes. He burns the academic papers. He puts you in the hallway without a tape measure. The geometry of the asylum shifts, but Ellie doesn't have time to measure it. She is too busy trying not to be digested by it. Read House of Leaves to study the blueprint of the labyrinth. Read Echoes to get lost in the construction site. This is the difference between reading a map of a trap and stepping into one. In Case Study 5, The Texture of Grime. The Cipher by Kathy Koja. The Mechanism. We read Kathy Koja for the grime. She defined the aesthetic of the fun hole, industrial decay, fluids, insects, the smell of ozone and rot. She taught us that horror could feel dirty. In the cipher, the grime is largely tactile and olfactory. You touch it, you smell it. Bish escalates to gustatory horror. He violates the final barrier, the mouth. He forces the grime past the lips. The rancid residue that coats Ellie's tongue is the evolution of Koja's texture. He forces the reader to swallow the setting. Read the cipher to dirty your hands. Read Echoes to dirty your soul. Keep that glass of water ready, because Koja makes you want to wash your hands. Bish makes you want to scrub your tongue. And Case Study number 6, The Mimicry of Nature. The Ruins by Scott Smith. Finally, The Ruins. We respect this book because it introduced predatory mimicry. The vines learn the voices of the tourists to lure them deeper. It is nature weaponizing our own communication. It is limited to the biological. It is plants versus humans. Bish transfers this intelligence to masonry. In Echoes, the asylum mimics the safety of the real world. Remember Daniel, the tour guide? He is the vine. He is the mimic. The polite informational posits are the flowers used to lure the prey into the throat of the building. Read the ruins to fear the jungle. Read Echoes to fear the indoors. Bish proves that a brick wall can lie to you just as effectively as a vine. This is your syllabus. If you have graduated from these 6 classes, you are finally ready for the exam. Echoes in the Stone is not just a book. It is the synthesis of everything these architects built. Don't read it because I told you to. Read it because the curriculum demands it. Before we close the file, we now need to talk about how you let this story in. In the archive, we believe that the format is part of the ritual. I have collected Echoes in the Stone in every available vessel: Kindle, hardcover, audio, and I did so for a specific structural reason. Each format changes the texture of horror. The totem, or the hardcover. First, the physical artifact. We talk often about cover art, but the imagery on this hardcover is not just a label, it is a warning sign. The dark, intriguing artistry here captures the systemic rot we discussed. It looks less like a book jacket and more like something you'd find peeling off a damp wall in a basement. For those of you building a Joshua Bish collection, the hardcover is non-negotiable. It has weight. It feels like a piece of the asylum that you can put on your shelf. A heavy, dark brick of dread. The virus. The Kindle. Then there's the Kindle. I keep this version for one reason: portability. There is something profoundly disturbing about having this asylum in your pocket. It allows you to take the sensory annihilation into the grocery store, the subway, the park. It proves that the horror isn't tied to a location, it travels with you. The voice, the audible experience. But if you want to understand the true power of this book, you need to hear it. The Audible edition is a necessity. It is narrated by Daniel Larivie, La- and I practiced this several times beforehand. The Riviere, yeah, the Riviere. And I do not say this lightly. This is a performance that rivals the legendary Mark Thompson. The Riviere doesn't just read the text, he metabolizes it. He captures the mind's eye portrait of every character with a shifting pitch and cadence that is terrifyingly precise. When he speaks as Daniel the guide, you hear the slick, polite trap. When he speaks as Ellie, you hear the oxygen leaving the room. But his greatest trick, he captures the sensory inputs. Remember the taste of metal I told you about? When Le Riviere describes that rancid residue, you can hear the grit in his throat. He brings the asylum to life, not with sound effects, but with a delivery that mimics the respiration of a living thing. My recommendation: if you are brave, get the hardcover for the shelf. But if you want the asylum to whisper directly into your ear, get the audio. Just be careful listening to it in the dark. The Riviere's voice has a way of staying in the room after you hit pause. And reader's response. Finally, we turn to the public record. I am not the only one who has felt the weight of this book. The consensus from our field agents, the readers, is absolute. Echoes in the Stone is not a story for the impatient. The reports describe an atmosphere that possesses physical mass, a setting steeped in history and grief where the sorrow seems to ooze from the stones themselves. Multiple witnesses report that the asylum does not function as a backdrop, but as a living presence where silence carries the density of a threat. The dread here isn't derived from cheap shocks, but from a steady sense that something is off beneath the surface, a feeling that the walls are carrying memories of their own. It is widely described as a visceral experience, a story that settles in slowly, refuses to leave, and makes the reader feel as though something is waiting just out of sight. Beyond the atmospheric pressure, the community has resonated deeply with the burden of inheritance that defines Ellie Glass's journey. Readers praise the characters for behaving with unsettling realism. They hesitate, they second guess, and they avoid what's right in front of them, mirroring our own human instincts when faced with the unexplainable. This is highlighted as a scary trip into the woods of West Virginia, where the horror is deeply personal, tied to land, history, and the things families pass down unintentionally. The final verdict from the public is that Echoes creates a quiet, unavoidable sense of unease that lingers long after the final page. As one reader noted, the fear here builds until it becomes impossible to ignore, leaving a strong impression that feels less like a memory of a book and more like a scar. My verdict, or my review. If the Psalm of the Terror trilogy was a complex, mournful sentence, Echoes in the Stone is the bold, jagged exclamation point that stamps the validity of Joshua Bish's evolution. Here, the author graduates from psychological siege, where the horror surrounds you, to psychological annihilation, where the horror invades you. Bish succeeds in making the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum not just a setting, but a biological intruder. The atmosphere is so dense it feels respiratory. I found the experience of reading this text to be genuinely invasive. The descriptions of the air carry a rancid residue of old metal and wet rot that is so tactile, I frequently had to reach for a glass of water just to wash the phantom taste of the asylum from my mouth. The true terror, however, lies in the structural deception. Through characters like Daniel the Guide, Bish offers polite informational posits that lull the reader into a false sense of historical detachment, only to strip that safety away the moment the protagonist steps off the path. The building doesn't just creak, it breathes with a hunger that feels ancient and freezing. By anchoring the supernatural elements in the grim historical reality of Dr. Freeman's lobotomies, Bish reveals that the patients of the past are not merely seeking a cure. They were part of a food chain. This is a masterclass in atmospheric deluge, a story that warns you that the walls aren't just watching, they are salivating. So, what is the verdict of the archive? Echoes in the Stone is a structural triumph. It is a masterclass in shifting the gears of horror from siege to annihilation. It is a book that demands and rewards a strong stomach. Joshua Bish has not just written a sequel to his career, he has written a warning. He has reminded us that in the dark, we are not the observers, we are the calories. My advice: buy the book, read it with the lights on, and for God's sake, keep a glass of water nearby. You're going to need it. And before we depart, as always on the channel, I'm going to ask you for that like and subscribe. Now, that certainly helps out the algorithm, for the channel itself, but as I've stated in all of the videos in the past, it helps out the authors that we cover even more by getting their names and works into the algorithms themselves. Um, and I've also stated in past videos that I do not understand the science behind that, but I've been told that other authors have been getting a lot more activity on their personal sites or pages or channels because of the traffic from the Veiled Archive. And you can't possibly know what that means to each of these authors. The indie author space it can be both frustrating but so rewarding, and it's not about sales. It's about connections and building community, and that's realistically what your like and subscribe does. So if you've done them already, I really appreciate it. I have noticed the growth recently, and I appreciate each and every one of you for hitting that like and subscribe. Um, Absolutely push the word out if this is something that, hey, your friends, your neighbors, your family are also interested in. As we here on the channel also work towards uh, building partnerships with other channels for review purposes, but absolutely to get more eyes on the indie authors in the community. So, with that, I appreciate your time. I know this has been a long video, and the book was very well deserving of that. I didn't really get into my personal takeaway on this, but I'm thinking I might actually make another video for that because we've already run past a half hour on this one. Um, but yeah, this file is closed. But until next time on the Veiled Archive.